The corner office was perfectly dark, save for the city lights bleeding through the rain-slicked glass. Victoria held her breath, feigning sleep on the leather sofa, waiting for the janitor to steal her decoy documents. Instead, he leaned over her trembling frame and whispered a secret only a dead man knew. At 34, Victoria Sterling was the youngest female billionaire in the logistics and artificial intelligence sector. Her company, Sterling Vanguard, occupied the top 10 floors of a sleek, brutalist skyscraper in downtown Chicago. To the public, Victoria was a paragon of modern innovation, a ruthless, brilliant CEO who had taken her late father's mid-sized shipping company and transformed it into a global tech empire. But from the inside, Victoria's world was a high-altitude pressure cooker, and lately, the pressure was threatening to blow the doors off. Someone was leaking her source code. For 3 months, proprietary algorithms designed to revolutionize autonomous freight routing had been quietly slipping into the hands of her biggest European rival, the Kessel Group. The leaks were surgically precise, extracting only the most valuable lines of code without triggering the company's multi-million-dollar cybersecurity protocols. It was an inside job. It had to be. Victoria trusted no one. She had spent the last fortnight quietly auditing her executive board. She had scrutinized Richard Hayes, her polished and overly ambitious chief financial officer, who had recently purchased a multi-million-dollar estate in Aspen that far exceeded his salary. She had investigated Simon Cole, her head of security, an ex-intelligence officer whose background was as murky as his methods. But their digital footprints were clean. Then, Simon brought her a piece of peculiar CCTV footage. "It's likely nothing, Victoria," Simon had said, sliding an encrypted tablet across her sprawling mahogany desk. "But you asked me to flag any anomalies on the executive floor." The grainy black and white video showed the night shift janitor, a man named Thomas Gable. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his early 40s, hired 6 months prior by a third-party contracting agency. He had a slight limp and a perpetually exhausted demeanor. What made Thomas notable wasn't his work ethic, but his baggage. He was a single father who routinely brought his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, to work. Management had turned a blind eye because Thomas hid the girl away in the lower-level maintenance break room, where she slept on a cot while he scrubbed floors until dawn. In the footage, Thomas was vacuuming the hallway outside Victoria's office. But as he passed her heavy oak door, he paused. He didn't just look at the door. He leaned close to the biometric keypad, his eyes darting to the ceiling cameras, before hurriedly moving on. He lingered for 14 seconds, Simon noted, his voice devoid of emotion. "And I ran a background check on the contracting agency. Kessel Group owns a 20% shell stake in their parent company." Victoria's blood had run cold. Was it really that simple? Was her corporate empire being dismantled by a man wielding a feather duster and a mop? It seemed almost insulting. A low-level physical infiltration bypassed all her state-of-the-art firewalls. She decided she wouldn't leave this to Simon. If Thomas Gable was a corporate spy, she wanted to catch him in the act. She wanted to look him in the eye when she destroyed him. The plan was dangerously simple. Victoria fabricated a red herring file, a physical leather-bound dossier stamped with Project Olympus, final architecture. Inside, she placed a tracker and a set of entirely useless, dummy equations that looked authentic to the untrained eye. On a stormy Tuesday night in mid-November, Victoria dismissed her assistant early. She left the heavy oak door to her office slightly ajar. She positioned the Olympus dossier carelessly on the edge of her desk, directly under the soft glow of a banker's lamp. Then, she moved to the plush Chesterfield sofa in the shadowy corner of her office, kicked off her designer heels, and draped a cashmere throw over her legs. She slowed her breathing, closed her eyes to mere slits, and waited for the spider to enter her web. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The skyscraper, usually humming with the manic energy of hundreds of employees, settled into a deep, groaning silence. Outside, the wind howled off Lake Michigan, driving sheets of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 1:15 a.m., Victoria's muscles ached from holding her rigid posture. She began to doubt herself. Maybe Simon was wrong. Maybe Thomas was just a tired father who had paused in the hallway to catch his breath. Then, she heard it. The faint, rhythmic squeak of rubber wheels on marble. The cleaning cart was approaching. Victoria's pulse hammered against her ribs, loud as a drum in the quiet room. She forced her body to go entirely limp, burying her face slightly into the armrest, maintaining a perfect view of the desk and the doorway through the curtain of her dark hair. The door creaked open. The hallway light spilled into the dark office, casting a long, distorted shadow across the Persian rug. Thomas Gable stood in the threshold. For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. He stood perfectly still, a silhouette framed by the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor. In one hand, he held a microfiber cloth. In the other, a small plastic spray bottle. Victoria watched him through the narrowest slit of her eyelashes, her adrenaline spiking. "Take the bait," she thought, her mind racing with a mix of triumph and fury. "Walk over to the desk, grab the file, and I'll have security in here before you reach the elevators." Thomas stepped into the room. He didn't head for the desk. Instead, he went straight to the recycling bin by the door, emptying it into his cart with practiced, quiet efficiency. He sprayed a cloth and began to wipe down the glass coffee table, his movements slow and methodical. He hummed a low, tuneless melody beneath his breath, a lullaby, perhaps, something he sang to the little girl sleeping down in the basement. He seemed entirely oblivious to the glowing lamp and the highly classified dossier sitting in plain sight. Victoria felt a flicker of confusion. Was he playing dumb? Did he know she was there? She let out a soft, measured sigh, shifting her weight slightly on the leather sofa, adjusting her arm so it hung limply toward the floor. A perfect picture of an overworked executive who had pushed herself to the point of collapse. Thomas froze. His head snapped toward the shadowy corner where she lay. Victoria held her breath. This is it. He set his cleaning bottle down on the cart. Slowly, his rubber-soled shoes padding silently against the carpet, he began to cross the vast expanse of the office. But he wasn't walking toward the desk. He was walking toward her. Panic, sharp and icy, flared in Victoria's chest. She had assumed he was a corporate thief, a pawn hired to photograph documents. What if he wasn't? What if Kessel Group had decided that stealing her code wasn't enough? What if they wanted to eliminate the architect entirely? She was completely alone. She had explicitly told Simon and the night security team to stay off the top floor so as not to spook the target. Her phone was in her purse, 5 feet away on the chair. Thomas stood towering over her. The scent of him cheap industrial cleaner, stale coffee, and a faint hint of rain washed over her. Victoria's muscles tensed, ready to spring, ready to scream. She saw his hand reach out in the darkness, but the hand didn't go for her throat. It went to the cashmere blanket that had slipped down to her knees. With surprising gentleness, Thomas grabbed the edge of the heavy fabric and pulled it up, tucking it warmly around her shoulders. Victoria's mind short-circuited. A blanket? The man suspected of corporate espionage was tucking her in? He stood there for another second, looking down at her. Victoria prepared to close her eyes fully, assuming he would now turn to the desk to steal the files, secure in the knowledge that she was deeply asleep. Instead, Thomas dropped to one knee. His face came dangerously close to hers, his features obscured in the shadows, his breath warm against her ear. When he spoke, his voice was not the deferential, nervous stammer of a janitor. It was a dark, gravelly whisper, dripping with absolute authority and a chilling familiarity. Your breathing is too shallow for REM sleep, Victoria. You always held your breath when you were pretending to be asleep, even when you were 8 years old. Victoria's heart stopped. Only one person in the world knew that. Only her father, Arthur Sterling, used to tease her about her fake sleeping when he came to read her bedtime stories. Arthur had been dead for 3 years. Before she could process the impossibility of the statement, Thomas's whisper continued, colder and more urgent than before. Do not open your eyes. Do not move. The cameras in this room have been looped since midnight, but the microphone in your banker's lamp is live. Richard Hayes planted it yesterday. Victoria felt a scream lodge in her throat, trapped by a paralyzing mix of terror and shock. Her CFO. Richard. He was the leak. I am not here for your fake Olympus file, Thomas breathed, his voice barely a vibration in the quiet room. I am here because Richard finalized the sale of the Vanguard algorithm to Kessel Group 3 hours ago, and now that he has the money, you are a loose end. The brakes on your customized Mercedes have been drained. If you drive home tonight, you will die on the Lakeshore Drive curve, just like your father died when they tampered with his pacemaker. Tears, hot and unbidden, pricked the corners of Victoria's tightly shut eyes. Her father's death ruled a tragic, sudden heart failure. She had never believed it, but the autopsy had been conclusive. "Who are you?" Victoria mouthed silently, her lips barely moving, praying he could read them in the dark. Thomas leaned back slightly, his hand resting on the arm of the sofa, a heavy, reassuring weight. "My name isn't Thomas Gable," he whispered, the sound cutting straight through her soul. "I was Arthur's private fixer. I'm the ghost your father paid to keep you alive. And tonight, little bird, we are going to burn this company to the ground." He stood up, his knee popping slightly in the quiet room. "Go back to sleep, Miss Sterling," he said loudly, his voice instantly reverting to the timid, subservient tone of a janitor. "I'll make sure the lights are off." The click of the switch plunged the office into total darkness. The squeak of the cart resumed, growing fainter as he pushed it out into the hallway, leaving Victoria alone in the pitch black, her world entirely shattered. The silence in the office was deafening. Victoria lay paralyzed in the pitch black, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of grief, terror, and absolute disbelief. "Your father died when they tampered with his pacemaker." The words echoed in her skull, a sickening mantra that threatened to pull her under. For 3 years, she had carried the crushing weight of her father's death, believing the coroner's report that his heart had simply given out from the stress of building Sterling Vanguard. She had blamed the company. She had blamed herself for not taking on more responsibility sooner, and all along it had been murder. Victoria forced herself to breathe, in, out, slowly. She remembered Nathaniel's warning, "The microphone in your banker's lamp is live." Richard Hayes was listening. Summoning every ounce of her boardroom discipline, Victoria groaned, feigning the heavy, groggy awakening of someone who had just napped on a stiff sofa. She sat up, letting the cashmere blanket fall to the floor. She stretched her arms, purposely bumping the side of the mahogany desk, making enough noise to register on the hidden bug. "God!" she muttered aloud, infusing her voice with exhaustion. "What time is it?" She grabbed her phone, ignoring the fake Olympus dossier completely. She needed to leave, but she couldn't take her car. If she avoided the Mercedes, Richard would know she had been tipped off. She needed an excuse that a listening CFO would believe. She tapped her phone screen, dialing her executive assistant's voicemail. "Sarah, it's Victoria. It's almost 2 in the morning. I fell asleep in the office. I'm too exhausted to drive, and my vision is blurry from staring at screens all day. I'm leaving the Mercedes in the executive garage and calling a black car. Reschedule my 9 a.m. with the logistics team. I need to sleep." She hung up, hoping the performance was convincing. She grabbed her trench coat, her hands shaking so violently she could barely slip her arms into the sleeves. As she shoved her hands deep into the pockets, her fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar, a small, cheap, prepaid cell phone. He had slipped it into her pocket when he tucked the blanket around her. The janitor, the fixer. Victoria rode the private elevator down to the subterranean garage. The concrete cavern was freezing and bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lights. She walked past her customized silver Mercedes-Benz. It sat there, gleaming and lethal, a meticulously crafted metal coffin. She stared at the sleek front grille, her stomach churning at the thought of hurtling down the Lakeshore Drive curve at 70 miles per hour, slamming the brake pedal to the floor, and feeling nothing but the terrifying give of empty hydraulics. She quickly averted her eyes, walked out to the rain-swept street, and climbed into the back of the waiting town car. Once she was safely inside her fortified penthouse on the Gold Coast, she locked the doors, drew the heavy blackout curtains, and pulled the prepaid phone from her pocket. There was one message in the drafts folder. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., the Botanical Gardens greenhouse. Wear a hat, N." She didn't sleep. She spent the remaining hours of the night pacing the hardwood floors, drinking black coffee, and meticulously reviewing every interaction she had ever had with Richard Hayes. Richard, with his perfectly tailored suits and paternal smiles. Richard, who had held her hand at her father's funeral and promised to help her guide the company through the storm. The betrayal was a physical ache in her chest. At dawn, Victoria slipped out of her building through the service entrance, wearing a generic dark raincoat and a wide-brimmed baseball cap. The Chicago Botanical Gardens were nearly deserted at this hour, a damp, misty sanctuary far removed from the glass and steel of the financial district. She found him in the tropical greenhouse, standing amidst the towering ferns and blooming orchids. Without the blue industrial jumpsuit, he looked entirely different. He wore a dark, tailored pea coat and a slate gray scarf. His posture was military straight, his limp entirely gone. The exhausted, subservient janitor was nowhere to be seen. The man standing before her possessed a quiet, dangerous intensity. "You're punctual," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were a piercing, calculating gray. "Who are you?" Victoria demanded, keeping her distance, her hands balled into fists inside her coat. "My real name is Nathaniel Cross," he said smoothly. 15 years ago, I was a private intelligence contractor operating in Eastern Europe. An operation went south. I was burned, hunted, and out of resources. Your father, who was expanding Sterling Vanguard's shipping routes in the region at the time, smuggled me out in one of his freight containers. He saved my life. In return, I became his shadow. "A hitman?" Victoria asked, the word tasting sour in her mouth. "A problem solver," Nathaniel corrected. "I handled the threats that the police and the lawyers couldn't. Corporate espionage, blackmail, hostile takeovers involving unsavory actors. Arthur kept my existence completely off the books. I was his insurance policy." "If you were his insurance policy, where the hell were you when they killed him?" Victoria's voice cracked, the raw anger bleeding through her corporate armor. Nathaniel flinched, the first sign of emotion she had seen from him. He looked down at the damp paving stones. "I was in Berlin, tracking a leak in the European division. By the time I realized it was a coordinated distraction orchestrated from inside Chicago, it was too late. Arthur was dead. The coroner was bought, the pacemaker data was wiped, and the trail went cold." "Richard," Victoria breathed. "Richard," Nathaniel confirmed. "It took me 2 years to untangle the financial web. He didn't just kill your father, Victoria. He has been systematically dismantling Vanguard from the inside. He partnered with the Kessel Group 3 years ago. They orchestrated Arthur's death because Arthur refused to sell the autonomous routing division. They knew you were young, grieving, and overwhelmed. They thought you would eventually buckle and sell. But I didn't," Victoria said, her jaw hardening. "I expanded it." "Exactly, which made you a problem. For the last year, Richard has been feeding them the source code piecemeal, waiting for a massive offshore payday. That payday cleared yesterday at noon. Over $80 million transferred into a decentralized crypto wallet. He doesn't need the company anymore. He needs you out of the picture so he can step in as interim CEO and oversee a full merger with Kessel." Victoria leaned against a damp stone pillar, the heavy, humid air of the greenhouse suddenly suffocating. Why the janitor disguise? Why Thomas Gable? Because the executive floor is heavily monitored. I needed physical access to Richard's office, the server rooms, and you. I fabricated a background, paid off the contracting agency, and slipped in. "And Lily? The little girl in the basement?" A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "Lily is my daughter. She's real, and she is perfectly safe. Having a child in tow made me invisible. People see a struggling single father, and they look right through him with pity. It's the perfect camouflage. No one suspects the guy washing vomit out of a rug to be running a decryption program on the CFO's private terminal." Victoria took a deep breath, the cold reality of the situation settling over her like a suit of armor. She wasn't a victim. She was Victoria Sterling. "You said we're going to burn the company to the ground," she said, locking eyes with Nathaniel. "I assume you have a plan." "I have the blueprints," Nathaniel said, pulling a encrypted flash drive from his pocket. "But to light the match, I need you to play the role of a lifetime today. Richard is going to walk into that office expecting to hear about a fatal car crash on the morning news. You need to walk in there, look the man who murdered your father in the eye, and smile." At 8:45 a.m., Victoria strode onto the top floor of the Sterling Vanguard building. She wore a sharp, crimson designer suit, a deliberate choice, the color of blood, the color of war. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, a rhythmic, commanding sound that caused heads to turn as she passed. "Good morning, Victoria," her assistant, Sarah, chirped from her desk. "I saw your message. Are you feeling better?" "Much better, Sarah. A little sleep does wonders," Victoria replied, her voice smooth and bright. "Is Richard in yet?" "He arrived about 10 minutes ago. He's in his office." "Perfect." Victoria walked down the glass-walled corridor toward the CFO's suite. Through the frosted glass, she could see Richard pacing. He was holding a cell phone to his ear, his usually perfect posture rigid with tension. He was waiting for a call from the police, or a news alert. Victoria pushed the door open without knocking. Richard jumped, fumbling the phone, his face draining of color as he turned to look at her. For a fraction of a second, absolute horror flashed in his pale blue eyes. It was all the confirmation she needed. "Victoria?" he choked out, quickly recovering, though his voice was noticeably higher than usual. "Good Lord, you startled me. I didn't expect to see you in so early. You look well." "Thank you, Richard," Victoria smiled, a terrifyingly serene expression that didn't reach her eyes. She strolled into his office, casually trailing a hand along the edge of his immaculate glass desk. "I had a rough night. Worked late, ended up crashing on the sofa in my office. Left my car in the garage and took a cab home. I just couldn't face the drive in the rain." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. A wise decision. Lakeshore Drive is treacherous in that weather. "Exactly what I thought," Victoria said breezily. "Anyway, I'm pulling an emergency board meeting for 4 p.m. today. I need you to prepare the Q3 financial disclosures." Richard frowned, his panic momentarily giving way to corporate confusion. "An emergency meeting? Why? The quarterly review isn't for another 2 weeks." "I know," Victoria said, leaning in close, smelling the expensive sandalwood cologne that masked the rot underneath. "But I've discovered a massive discrepancy in the European server logs." "It looks like we have a leak, Richard." "A big one. Someone has been stealing the Vanguard algorithm." Richard's eyes widened, a micro-expression of sheer panic. "A leak? Are you certain?" "Absolutely. And I've traced the IP address right back to our own executive floor." Victoria paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room, watching the sweat begin to bead on his forehead. "I've hired an outside forensic data firm. They are running a full sweep of the building as we speak. We are going to find the rat, Richard. And when we do, I'm going to make a very public, very brutal example of them." She patted his shoulder lightly. He was stiff as a board. "See you at 4, Richard." Victoria left him standing there and returned to her office. She closed the heavy oak door and immediately pulled out the prepaid phone. "He took the bait," she texted Nathaniel. "I know. He just logged into his secure terminal to try and scrub his tracks." Nathaniel's reply came seconds later. "The panic is making him sloppy. I'm in the ventilation shaft above the primary server room. He's attempting to transfer the remaining decentralized crypto into a Swiss account before your forensic team finds it." "Let him," Victoria texted back. "Executing the bypass now. Lily is running the trace from the van." Victoria sat at her desk, staring at the fake Olympus dossier still sitting under the lamp. The plan was a high-wire act. By telling Richard about the fake forensic sweep, she had forced him into emergency mode. He was trying to move the money and erase his digital footprint, but what Richard didn't know was that his private terminal had been physically compromised. Last night, while Richard was busy tampering with her car brakes, Nathaniel, in his guise as Thomas the janitor, had unscrewed the back panel of Richard's computer and installed a hardware keylogger and a network bridge. Every keystroke, every password, every desperate attempt Richard made to hide the Kessel Group payments was being intercepted and recorded by Nathaniel and his daughter. The hours ticked by. The tension in the executive suite was palpable. Richard was frantic. He canceled all his morning meetings, locking himself in his office, his blinds drawn tightly shut. At 3:30 p.m., Victoria's burner phone vibrated. "Got him," Nathaniel wrote. "I have the routing numbers, the offshore account ownership documents proving he controls the Kessel shell companies, and the biometric logs showing he accessed the executive garage at 11 p.m. last night. It's a kill shot." "Bring it to the boardroom," Victoria replied. "I'll be wearing blue," Nathaniel answered. At 3:55 p.m., Victoria walked into the expansive, glass-walled boardroom. The massive mahogany table seated 12. The board members, a mix of seasoned tech investors and logistics barons, were already filing in, murmuring amongst themselves about the sudden summons. Richard Hayes walked in last. He looked like a man walking to his own execution, though he was desperately trying to maintain his polished facade. He carried a leather briefcase, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. He took his seat to Victoria's right, refusing to make eye contact. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Victoria began, standing at the head of the table. She pressed a button on a remote, and the smart glass walls of the boardroom instantly frosted over, turning opaque, sealing them inside. I called you here today because Sterling Vanguard is facing an existential threat, Victoria said, her voice echoing in the soundproof room. For the past year, our most guarded intellectual property has been systematically stolen and sold to the Kessel Group. Gasps and angry murmurs erupted around the table. However, Victoria continued, raising a hand to silence them, the threat does not come from hackers. It does not come from a foreign government. It comes from inside this room. She turned slowly, locking her eyes onto Richard. Richard stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is absurd, he stammered, pointing an accusatory finger at Victoria. You're unstable, Victoria. The stress has finally broken you. I've been reviewing the financials, and frankly, the board needs to consider a vote of no confidence in your leadership. Before he could finish his desperate deflection, the boardroom doors swung open. A man stepped into the room. He was wearing a faded blue industrial jumpsuit, a name tag that read Thomas, pinned to his chest. He pushed a gray plastic cleaning cart filled with mops and spray bottles. The board members stared in bewilderment. Excuse me, one of the investors snapped. We are in the middle of a highly classified meeting. Security. Security is currently locked out of this floor, the janitor said, his voice deep, carrying an authority that completely contradicted his uniform. He stopped the cart at the end of the table. He reached into the trash bin on the cart, moved aside some crumpled paper, and pulled out a thick, sleek black laptop. He opened it, tapped a few keys, and suddenly, the massive presentation screens behind Victoria flared to life. There, in glaring high definition, were bank records. Decrypted offshore account statements. A shell corporation named Aegis Consulting registered in the Cayman Islands, listing Richard Hayes as the sole beneficiary. Beside it, a ledger of deposits from the Kessel Group totaling over $80 million. What is this? Richard whispered, all the blood draining from his face as he stared at the screen. That, the janitor said smoothly, peeling the fake Thomas name tag off his chest and tossing it onto the table, is your confession, Richard. The boardroom erupted. The 12 distinguished members of the Sterling Vanguard board, usually paragons of composed corporate stoicism, were suddenly shouting over one another. Chairs scraped against the polished mahogany floors as several investors stood up, pointing aggressively at the massive LED screens. The evidence was undeniable. The documents displayed weren't just internal logs. They were decrypted, verified statements from UBS, the Union Bank of Switzerland, showing real-time transfers from the Kessel Group into the Aegis Consulting shell account. Alongside them were Richard's digitally signed authorization forms, proving he had manipulated the corporate firewall to allow the data extraction. Richard Hayes stood frozen, his immaculate composure shattering like cheap glass. The color had entirely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen gray. He stared at the man in the blue janitor's suit, his mind struggling to reconcile the subservient floor cleaner he had ignored for 6 months with the lethal operative who had just dismantled his entire life's work. "This is a fabrication!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking hysterically over the din of the boardroom. He slammed his hands onto the table, glaring at the board members. "It's a deepfake. Victoria has orchestrated this to push me out because I challenged her authority. You all know she's been under tremendous psychological strain." "Save it, Richard," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a diamond-tipped blade. She didn't raise her volume, but the absolute, freezing authority in her tone silenced the room instantly. "We have the biometric logs of you accessing my vehicle at 11 o'clock last night. We have the decrypted messages between you and Kessel's acquisition team. And we have the audio recording of you authorizing the final data packet transfer from your secure terminal 3 hours ago." Richard's eyes darted wildly toward the frosted glass doors, calculating the distance. He reached a trembling hand into his tailored suit jacket, pulling out his cell phone. "Simon!" Richard yelled into the device, hitting the speed dial for the head of security. "Simon, get a tactical team up to the boardroom immediately. The CEO has lost her mind. We have an intruder." Nathaniel didn't move toward him. He simply reached into the deep pocket of his industrial jumpsuit and pulled out a small, black tactical earpiece. He tossed it casually onto the long mahogany table. It skittered across the polished wood, coming to a halt precisely in front of Richard. "Simon Cole is currently indisposed," Nathaniel stated, his slate-gray eyes locked onto the panicked CFO. He and his 3 closest guards are zip-tied to the plumbing fixtures in the sub-level 4 HVAC control room. It turns out your ex-intelligence officer wasn't nearly as vigilant as his resume suggested. He traded his loyalty for a cut of your offshore payout, didn't he? Richard dropped the phone. It clattered against the table, the dial tone buzzing faintly in the silent room. "You're insane! Both of you!" Richard hissed, backing away toward the wall, his chest heaving. "You think you can just trap me here? You think Kessel Group is going to let this go? They have a $90 billion market cap. They will bury you, Victoria. They will bury this entire company in litigation until there is nothing left but ash." "Let them try," Victoria replied, walking slowly around the edge of the table until she stood just a few feet from the man who had murdered her father. "Because by the time the markets open tomorrow morning, I am releasing the entirety of the Kessel Group's stolen source code to the public domain. Open source, free for every tech startup and logistics firm on the planet to use, modify, and distribute." The board members gasped. It was a nuclear option. "You'll destroy our valuation," one of the senior investors cried out. "I will destroy Kessel's exclusive advantage," Victoria corrected sharply, never taking her eyes off Richard. "Sterling Vanguard will pivot. We will offer the premium enterprise integration and security infrastructure for the open source code. We will survive. But the $80 million Kessel just paid you for exclusive rights? That is now completely worthless. You stole a monopoly, Richard, and I am turning it into public infrastructure." Richard's knees finally gave out. He slumped against the frosted glass wall, sliding down until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. The realization washed over him. Not only was he going to prison, but he had failed to deliver the Kessel Group's prize. He was a dead man either way. The heavy, soundproof doors of the boardroom suddenly clicked and hissed open. 4 plainclothes detectives from the Chicago Police Department's White-Collar Crimes Division stepped into the room, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Leading them was Detective Harrison, a seasoned veteran Victoria had contacted an hour prior, using the irrefutable data Nathaniel had compiled. "Richard Hayes," Detective Harrison said, his voice gravelly and devoid of sympathy as he pulled a pair of steel cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for corporate espionage, felony wire fraud, and the conspiracy to commit the murder of Arthur Sterling. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it." Victoria watched in cold satisfaction as the officers hauled Richard to his feet, wrenched his arms behind his back, and secured the handcuffs. The metallic click was the loudest, most beautiful sound she had ever heard. As they marched him out of the boardroom, Richard didn't look back. He was a hollowed-out shell, a ghost of the arrogant man who had walked in. Once the police were gone, Victoria turned to the stunned board of directors. "This meeting is adjourned," she said, her voice dropping back to a calm, terrifyingly professional register. "I expect all of your resignations on my desk by tomorrow morning. Any of you who fight me will face a full audit of your communications with Richard over the last 3 years." They didn't argue. They gathered their briefcases and filed out of the room in absolute silence, casting fearful, reverent glances at the young CEO and the quiet, dangerous man in the janitor's uniform standing behind her. When the room was finally empty, Victoria let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had sustained her for the last 12 hours began to crash, leaving her legs feeling like lead. She gripped the back of a leather chair to steady herself. Nathaniel stepped forward, his demeanor softening. He reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You played it perfectly, little bird," he said quietly. "Arthur would have been incredibly proud." Victoria looked up at him, the exhaustion finally showing in her eyes, mixed with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. The crushing weight of the last 3 years, the grief, the paranoia, the agonizing feeling that she had failed, her father evaporated. "We need to get to the basement," Victoria said, a genuine, albeit tired, smile breaking across her face. "I believe there is a 7-year-old girl down there who is probably very hungry, and I need to offer her father a massive promotion." Nathaniel smiled back, the cold edge of the operative melting away to reveal the devoted father underneath. "She likes deep dish pizza. And, as for the promotion, I think head of global security has a nice ring to it." "Done," Victoria said. Together, they walked out of the glass fortress, leaving the shadows behind them. The storm outside had finally broken, and the afternoon sun was beginning to pierce through the Chicago skyline, casting long, golden rays across the marble floors of a newly reclaimed empire. Victoria Sterling never feigned sleep again. With Richard Hayes serving a life sentence in a federal penitentiary and the Vanguard algorithm dominating the open source market, her company soared to unprecedented, untouchable heights. Nathaniel Cross discarded the janitor's uniform, stepping out of the shadows to stand as her impenetrable shield. Together, they forged an unbreakable legacy, proving that the most dangerous predators are often the ones you never see coming.